Welcome to another Porchlight Book Company, Boswell Book Company collaborative virtual program. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell. Welcome to our author, welcome to Sally. And for more, I give you Sally Haldorson, the Managing Director of Porchlight Book Company.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody who is joining us today in conversation about this very important book. And we are going to talk for the next about 45, 50 minutes about just why it is so important. But first, I would like to introduce our guest for tonight, my partner in conversation, Andre Sólo.
Hey, everybody.
And Andre is the author of the book we're going to talk about tonight, Sensitive, The Hidden Power of the Highly Sensitive Person in a Loud, Fast, Too Much World, and the co-founder of Sensitive Refuge, the world's largest website for sensitive people. Sólo has spoken about sensitive people and sensitive leadership at Google, Amazon, and PayPal. He writes at Quartz, Psychology Today, Forbes, and has been featured in Time, the Washington Post, Oprah Daily, MSNBC, and The Telegraph, as well as numerous podcasts. A sensitive person himself, Sólo believes that the world needs more of what sensitive people have to offer. Welcome again.
Thank you.
For anybody who has not had a chance to read the book, it has only been out for a few weeks. I believe it came out in February.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
February 28th. So it's just out for a few weeks now.
Yeah. So I'd like to prime people a little bit with an introduction and remind people as well that Daniel will be putting the link to buy the book in the chat. And so make sure that during or after we're done with this conversation, you pick up a copy of Sensitive. Okay, so here we go. Susan Cain's Quiet changed the public conversation about introversion, helping introverts and the people around them appreciate a different style of being in the world, being competent in a society that overvalues brashness and boldness or just extroversion. It brought to attention the inherent strengths and aligned some of the misperceptions about introversion that we all collectively accepted. This new book from our guest tonight, Andre Sólo, and his co-author, Jennifer Granman, Sensitive, The Hidden Power of the Highly Sensitive Person in a Loud, Fast, Too Much World, works in a similar way. Sensitive is a distinction to be understood, to be leveraged, rather than a weakness to be fixed. And really what this book, like Quiet, contributes is on a level deeper than just boosting productivity or encouraging acceptance. What Sensitive gifts us with, those of us who see ourselves mirrored within these pages, is a better way to be in the world. Because being sensitive, where you might fall on the continuum, can be hard. It can be hard for the people themselves and hard for the people who support them. Because this isn't a world made for sensitive people. Whether it's suspicions about a sensitive person's competency or frustration with their atypical needs, here's the important thing. The applicability of this book isn't limited to those who identify as sensitive, even if it's key for them. This world has become so overstimulating that it's making everyone to some degree sensitive to it in ways we aren't aware, and that makes this book a book for everyone, so that we can all find a little bit of peace when everything is too loud, too fast, and too much. Andre, I'm so happy to have this conversation with you. I have a list of topics to touch on, but
me too. That's a heck of an intro. That's beautiful. Thank you.
I haven't stopped talking about this book in weeks.
Oh, wow.
And part of that is I'm going to admit that I think I'm a bit of a sensitivity denier. That's my new phrase that I've coined for myself. As someone who, once I read through your book, I thought, this explains so much about me. And it's not that I didn't appreciate that I was sensitive. It's that I've spent the last 50 years working against that. Yeah. And so there's a part of me that picked out a number of things in the book that I thought, oh, so that's why I've developed this habit of doing X, or this strategy to do Y, or why, when someone said to me when I was younger that I was, or when I apologized when I was younger for being a crier, or I had a boss once who said to me that I needed more time than the average person to reflect on something before giving my opinion. And at the time I thought, no, I don't. I can do it faster. I can think off the top of my head, or if someone says to me, you care too much, that there is, and I thought, well, that's right. I really should care less. No, not to that extreme, but you know what
Sure.
I think we all who identify with this book have had experiences that we can pick out that where we have felt bad about being sensitive. And so that's why we're here and why this book is so important, is going to really resonate with so many people.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly right. Yeah, I hope it is resonating with people. And I think that sensitive people are, we're 30% of the population, but we often feel like we're all alone or like no one else understands us. And I think that's what we're hoping to change.
So the first important distinction that I want to highlight is that in the book, you say that, and I know you have a co-author. She's not with us tonight, so I am going to refer to you. But of course, I'm speaking to both of your contributions to the book. But you make a distinction that sensitivity is biological, not a character defect, and that there's science behind that assertion. Can you walk us through the science that you uncovered?
Yes, I would love to. So I think first off, it helps to understand what we mean when we talk about being sensitive, right? Because I think a lot of us, when we hear the word sensitive, we sort of think of being weak or fragile, or maybe somebody who overreacts to things, they have a thin skin. And that's not actually what sensitive means. So as a personality trait, when we say someone's sensitive, it means that they take in more information from the world around them and they do more with it. And so sensitive people are actually wired at a brain level to process all information more deeply. It doesn't matter what it is. And by processing it more deeply, we mean spending more time on it, giving it more mental attention, putting more mental resources into it. And there's actually differences in the brain activity of people who test as highly sensitive because of this added processing, or this deeper processing that they're doing of information. And the cool thing about this is information comes in many different flavors, right? So for the brain, yeah, that includes things like just your physical surroundings, right? So sensitive people tend to be very attuned to subtle details around them. So it might be the kind of person who notices the scratchy texture of a fabric, or who notices like the subtle hints of apricot in a nice white wine. But information can also be emotional. And that's really kind of some of the most important information we have as human beings. It tells us what other people are intending and what they're trying to communicate. And the same thing is true for that. I mean, the sensitive brain processes those social cues and emotional cues more deeply, tends to pick up more information from them. So if you're a sensitive person, you might be the only one who noticed like that slight hint of a smile that flashed across someone's face before they managed to hide it. And it can tell you that maybe they're lying, or maybe they mean something other than what you thought, and you might be the only one who picks up on it. So that kind of deeper processing is really a powerful strength, and that's what it means to be sensitive. It's not something you can turn on or off. You tend to do it with everything. Sometimes it's irrelevant. You don't have to notice every tiny detail of your work cubicle or the commute to your job or anything like that. It's not useful, but sometimes it really pays off. And so we tend to see sensitive people be really deep thinkers. They tend to feel things very passionately and very strongly. They tend to be very aware of other people's needs and have a high level of empathy because of that. And they tend to be very creative and innovative because you're seeing connections that other people might not see. So that's really what sensitive is. And in terms of the science behind it, in terms of it being genetic, I should say, yeah, I think a lot of times we assume that if someone is sensitive, it must be that something happened to them, right? Like, oh, well, why did you get that way?
Yeah.
But again, if we put aside the idea that it means they're weak, right? Because a sensitive person on average doesn't mean they're anxious. It doesn't mean they're nervous. It doesn't mean they've been traumatized. It just means they process information more deeply. that does tend to be largely genetic. And, strictly speaking, by the numbers, it's almost 50-50. We know this from twin studies. If you have identical twins who have the same genes related to sensitivity, but they score differently on a sensitivity test, presumably that difference in their scores has something to do with how they were raised or their life experiences after they were raised. And we know that it's almost exactly 50-50 how much of that score comes from genes versus your upbringing. But that's a little bit misleading because the two parts play different roles. And if you are a sensitive person, if you score as highly sensitive, you probably were born that way. And your genes put you in like kind of the ballpark, right? So sensitivity is a continuum, like most traits. So you could be average, which is most people. You could be at the low end, which is fairly uncommon, or you could be highly sensitive, which is about maybe 30% of people. So nearly 1 in 3. And your genes kind of put you in one of those three camps, more or less. And then over the course of your life experiences might fine tune it a bit. You might get a little bit more sensitive or like a little bit less sensitive, but you're not going to generally go from one end to the other. And scientists know this because they've actually followed children for decades in some cases to watch them grow up and see how this changes over the course of a life. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the basics.
I think one of the things that's interesting when we reclaim words that maybe a lot of people have assumptions about, when we use the word sensitive, it does carry some weight. As I mentioned before, it can imply that someone cries easily, or it can imply that someone's feelings are hurt easily, or we think a lot, I think more often about children now who are sensitive to, as you said, certain materials, or maybe a tag on their shirt or things like that. They don't want to play with finger paint, and what does that mean? And we ask a lot of questions about that. But in actuality, I thought it was really interesting that you broke down and listed the 9 human sensory systems, because we think that our senses are only the 6 that we, or 5. What am I saying?
Yeah, yeah.
All of a sudden I was like, wait,
yeah, usually
5
5.
is something completely different. Okay, you break out all of the human sensory systems, and I'm apparently thinking of the Sixth Sense movie, or our own Sixth Sense, and maybe that's the other stuff we're talking about, is this sensitivity, right? But with the vestibular system and proprioceptive system and that kind of thing, that really our sensory processing happens all the time. And I don't think because it is so subconscious, we don't understand that we're processing with all that full system at all times. Yeah. And so then you go into an analogy that really simplified things for me. And it's the one that I've been sharing with everyone, is that the difference between the people who are highly sensitive and perhaps average or on the lower end have different size buckets. And that for sensitive people, their buckets fill up much more quickly, while someone who might not have as much sensitivity, they may fill their buckets more slowly. Can you talk a little bit more about that, probably in a more coherent way than I just did?
No, that's really coherent. Yeah, no, I love that. You're exactly right. I mean, we live in a world where we're being bombarded by constant sensory information, and that the amount of information we take in has crept up over time. Even as far back as 1903, the sociologist Georg Simmel gave a lecture in Dresden, Germany. And the point of the lecture, the point of the entire series was, let's talk about the glories of modern life and all this progress we're having. And Simmel just threw out the script and he said, no, let's talk about the effect all of this is having on the human mind. And he gave at the time a very kind of unheard of theory that there's a limit to how much human beings can process. And he said we have a limited amount of mental energy, that was his term. And everything you do throughout the day takes up a little bit of it. And part of you, like one side of you, the part that's driven by achievement and I have to hit this deadline, you can push through even when you're running out of mental energy. You can do that. But the other part of you, this very human part of you that's about your connection to other people, your sense of empathy, your feelings, your enjoyment of life, your spirit, you might say, that side of you, it can't keep up. Like it costs you something. And really what Simmel was saying was that humanity is too sensitive to, as a species, to just endlessly be on. And in his time, he was talking about things like, okay, now we have electric lights starting up and it's keeping us up later. And there's, you can go out late at night and do all these things. And there's a streetcar and you're packed in with all these people and you're rushing here and there. And the world was just getting busier and more crowded and louder. But today we have all of that he had, but we also have, of course, everything digital. So we're attached to a device that just is nonstop notifications. You open it up and it's endless streams of information, some of which you want to look at. I get addicted to TikTok very easily. And some of which is like, for the first time ever, your boss can text you at 10 p.m. and you kind of might feel like you have to respond, even if the policy is don't respond till the next morning, right? That just wasn't possible in Simmel's time unless they literally sent a courier to bang on your door, right? Which is probably a pretty big emergency.
Right,
so
right.
We just have all this information, and we have a limit. Everyone has a limit, because the brain it gets worn out processing all this. Every single shred of information takes mental effort to go through. And because sensitive people have that great gift of deeper processing, of I'm going to put more time, more energy into each little piece of information. The one downside that comes with the trait of being sensitive is you get overstimulated easily.
Mhm.
So if you're in an environment that is very loud, very crowded, very hectic, if you're being rushed, if the environment is just emotionally intense, you can quickly hit your limit, even if other people might not. And a big part of thriving as a sensitive person is to stop fighting that and pretending that you can just, ignore that limit, and to start building things into your life that will allow you to kind of refresh more often and cut down some of the stimulation and be at your best. Because if you give your mind the space that it really needs as a sensitive brain to thrive, it'll do wonders, right? It's a deep thinking mind for a reason, but it needs that space.
One of the things that I've been talking to people about this book is this chronic overstimulation, and this sort of, I'm not sure we even know it's happening anymore, in that same way that we may not, process the material that of the clothes that we're wearing. Or you mentioned, when you're driving your car, is it safe to make a left-hand turn? If you're walking, is it safe to cross the street? Like, all of this is being engaged. And we've gotten to the point where a lot of our overstimulation is automated as well. And we don't necessarily identify it as overstimulation. And I was thinking about, TikTok is a good example. Instagram is another good example. That is for me. I am not on TikTok. It's tempting, but I'm not.
Yeah.
But for Instagram, you think you're relaxing. You're like, I'm just going to take a break, stop working on what I'm working on, and I'm going to go scroll through Instagram for 10 minutes. But when you stop and think about the fact that to watch the stories on Instagram or watching, TikTok, you're participating in the lives of however many people have posted whatever it is you're watching, right? Like, you're assessing what someone is making for lunch, the outfit they bought from Target, the opinion they have about politics, the joke that they made about their dog. And you're like living partial lives of the 50 people whose stories go by in 10 minutes.
Yep.
And you think it's relaxing, but in actuality, you're using your judgment. You're saying, oh, I wish I had that. You're saying, oh, I'm glad I don't have that. Oh, I think differently than this. I should go do something. So there's a bunch of stimulation that comes from doing something that we think is relaxing. So how do we identify what we need in order to take these breaks?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I love that. So I think the first thing is to understand how sensitive you are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone does have a limit, and it's going to be helpful for anyone to know when they are hitting that limit. But if you are at the higher end of the sensitivity continuum, if you're one of those 30% of people like myself, you really need to know that about yourself. There's a few ways you can do that. In the book, there is a checklist of things you can go down and see how many of these do I check. And also on our website, which is Sensitive Refuge, so highlysensitiverefuge.com. We have a test you can take, right? That'll tell you how sensitive you approximately are on that continuum. If you're at the higher end, if you're a highly sensitive person, accept that about yourself for starters, and start to be conscientious of how much of your mental resources you're using on something, or as you put it, how much of your bucket you're filling up, even just the first halfway through the day. So being aware helps. It also helps to pay attention to some of the specific things that are indicators for you. Overstimulation happens to everyone. It's especially common for sensitive people. But the way it first happens is different for different people. For some people, it's a brain fog. For some people, it's because you can tell because they start snapping at someone else. For other people, they start to get physical symptoms first, the tightness in the shoulders, the headache, things like that. There's a lot of, even a feeling of like anxiety that doesn't have a clear cause, just like that might be overstimulation creeping in. So start to pay attention to it yourself. No, I'm like you, I was a sensitivity denier for most of my life. I did not realize I was sensitive, and it led me to no end of problems that I didn't know that about myself. I think especially as a boy growing up, you're kind of told not to think of yourself as sensitive and not to be sensitive. So for a long time, I did not understand that when I would start to lose my focus at work, start to feel really stressed out for no apparent reason, feel that sense of anxiety, start to get kind of tension headaches, that's not just because you've been physically sitting at a desk too long, right? It's because of the overstimulation. So know your own signs. But the most important thing, I think, that overall that anyone can do to help avoid overstimulation, is to build time into your day to process. Because the only reason you're getting overstimulated is because your brain, your sensitive brain, can't keep up anymore and can't deep process everything coming at it. So what happens if you just give it some time to process? Like, what happens if you decide, before I go to work each day, or after I get out of work each day, or whatever time is the best for your schedule, I'm going to take 20 minutes. That's all you need. I mean, some people I think would prefer an hour. I'd prefer an hour, but 20 minutes is usually pretty doable in a schedule. And I'm going to say, take that 20 minutes. And it might be that I go in my room. It might be that I sit in my favorite armchair. It might be that I sit in my home office, whatever it is, wherever your relaxing place is. And I'm going to not do anything. You can put on music if you want, or you can journal. That helps you process your thoughts, but you're not going to have an activity going. I'm not going to look at TikTok, right? For that 20 minutes. And instead, you're just letting your mind do its thing. And it's going to start thinking things through and catching up on things. And it's amazing how in just 20 minutes of letting your mind run, you can start to feel tremendously better and re-energized.
Right.
And not only that, you'll start to have these breakthrough moments, because the benefit of that deep processing is you're connecting ideas, you're seeing solutions, and suddenly you realize, oh, I bet if I offered this, that person who's really upset would actually be fine. Or I bet if I did this, we could solve that problem at work. Or I bet this would really help my kid, with that thing they're going through. And you start to have these breakthrough moments because you're letting your mind run. Give yourself the time, build it in your schedule.
That reminds me of the sort of three systems that you mentioned: the threat, drive, and soothe. So you've talked a little bit here about soothe, and I'm just going to quote what you wrote in the book. Because of the powerful nature of threat and drive, we're at our happiest when we keep those two systems in check, using them only on a part-time basis. Unfortunately, and without even realizing it, most of us spend the majority of our time in these systems, and we feel justified because it is, after all, what the toughness myth demands. So let's talk about those two things. We have the three systems: threat, drive, and soothe. And we also have this toughness myth. And I think we've hinted at it already a little bit about what that has meant to us as younger people, I suppose, and how those two help inform what's coming at sensitive people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the toughness myth is this idea that the answer to being overworked, fatigued, emotionally overwhelmed, overstimulated, tired, stressed out, the answer to that is to push through it. That's what the toughness myth tells us.
Yep.
This is deeply rooted in, especially in our country, with a history of being, we're rugged individuals and we're cowboys and we live on the frontier. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Milwaukee. This is part of Midwestern culture, especially. It's like we tough it out, we stick it out, and there's a value to that. Of course, there's a tremendous value to grit and being able to have some endurance and push through difficult things. That's a powerful lesson to have in your life, but you do have a limit. And the toughness myth becomes sort of the answer to everything. It's like, well, why can't we have a little more empathy? Why can't we have, why can't we slow down? Why can't we have, the answer is just, well, you have to tough it out. There's some kind of virtue that's seen in being tough. And it's not inherently virtuous. It's inherently very dangerous to ourselves. So the toughness myth sort of pushes us to not only to turn off our sensitivity, but to downplay our emotions, to downplay our needs, and to, in many cases, push ourselves not just to the level of being determined or, I'm really care about this, so I'll go 110%, but to push ourselves to the point of burnout, to the point of collapse, to the point of harming ourselves. That's the toughness myth. And these three systems that you mentioned, so though the toughness myth is sort of our take on what's happening with our country, or with our society, I should say. The three systems you mentioned, that comes from researchers. And the idea is that you sort of spend your time in either, a lot of the time we spend our time in drive, the first system, which is you're trying to get something done. I'm going to get my kid to their soccer game on time. I'm going to get this done. I get this done, come home, get dinner made, etc. Or I have these projects for work, or whatever it might be. I got to finish my novel, something that you need to hit certain goals. You need to get a certain timeline. You push yourself to get through it. It's a very productive state. It can feel very good. You can hit your flow in that state. There's nothing wrong with drive. It's great. But you can overdo it. The second system is threat, which is what happens when your fight or flight is triggered. And you get into this like panicky feeling where you're having maybe adrenaline or at least cortisol released all through your body. And it's going to start affecting how you feel, how you think, and maybe even your ability to do certain things. And that is also a helpful system. It's what has kept us alive as a species for so long, but it is meant to be only short, tiny doses. If we were in the wild, there should only be, 1 minute a week where you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. But the threats we have in our lives now are thankfully primarily not tiger related. Instead, there are these things that can happen all the time, right? Like every email that comes in might be an upset client, a new project from your boss when you're already overworked, who knows? Every phone call could seem like, oh God, I have to take this call now, I'm so busy. So these things start to trigger our threat drive, even though they shouldn't maybe rise to that level, but we're so overburdened they do. And it gets to a high level of burnout when you're in threat too long. And soothe is one that you should really spend a lot of time in, and we spend very little time in. That's when you're relaxing or you're doing something that is primarily enjoyable and makes you feel restored or better about life.
We have a couple questions coming in that I'll get to in just 1 second. I want to stretch this this sort of theme that we've been talking about how we acknowledge in ourselves that we're sensitive people, and how we manage some of that once we've identified that. And one of the, I think, big components of being a sensitivity denier, which we are coining, is that we blame ourselves or we feel guilty.
Yeah.
That there is, I'm jumping way toward the end of the book here, but you address shame, that there are all of these ways, probably because of the toughness myth, where we, whether it's trying to ask for what we need or taking that time off, taking that time out, taking a break, actually makes us feel really guilty or shameful. And you talk a lot about that. Can you explain why that is our tendency, and then possibly how we can work around that that vulnerability?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's natural, and given that our culture demands so much, and given that it's seen as a virtue to tough it out, of course, it's natural to feel shame. It's not a good thing to feel shame, but it becomes natural to feel shame if you feel like you're hitting your limit. And hitting your limit does not mean that you aren't capable of achieving things or getting things done. Oftentimes we keep performing and pushing ourselves after we really shouldn't have, because we are able to push through, but there's a point at which it becomes unhealthy. So of course we start to feel shame if we're not pushing through, because, well, if it's virtuous to do that, then what's wrong with me if I don't, right? And it's especially true because we don't value emotions that much in our culture.
Right.
If you I learned a long time ago that if I need to not if my dad wants to get together and do something and I'm not able to because of work, he's like, oh, that's fine.
Uh-huh.
If there's any other reason, like, I really need to take this weekend to relax, he's like, don't worry about that. We'll do it. I'm like, okay, yeah, there's just the emotional answer doesn't matter at all. It's only if there's an achievement oriented thing that excuses not doing something. So it's natural to have that shame. But I think one of the most important things we can do is to just flip the script on how we look at sensitivity. I mean, I think often even when we start to understand it as deep processing, I think the approach we take is often to start thinking, okay, well, how do I overcome it? How do I manage it? How do I treat it? It's not a diagnosis. It's a healthy personality trait. And it's actually one that's linked to giftedness, right?
Yep.
But I think it's really valuable to instead focus on the strengths that come with being a sensitive person. And there are many. The only downside, only one, is that overstimulation, that ability to get overloaded sometimes. And that's something you can entirely eliminate it. You can largely get rid of it if you're structuring your life in a way that works for your sensitivity.
Right.
But the flip side of that one drawback is this powerful set of strengths. So it is linked to giftedness. And we talked a little bit about creativity. The image of the sensitive artist is maybe the only stereotype of sensitive people that's true.
Right.
Most artists are sensitive people. Nicole Kidman is on the record not only as saying that she herself is a highly sensitive person, but she said that in her opinion, every actor is a highly sensitive person. It's almost as if you couldn't do the job if you weren't. A lot of musicians are, a lot of authors are, a lot of artists are. So that's true, but creativity is also how we innovate. It's useful in science and technology and business. And a lot of the greatest thinkers throughout history, if you go and look at their biographies, go and look at their journals, go and look at interviews with them when they were alive, they check a lot of the boxes of being highly sensitive people. And on that basis, without sensitive people, we wouldn't have the theory of evolution, we wouldn't have germ theory, and many others. Right? So just the creativity and innovation alone makes it a really useful trait, but it's so much more than that. We talked about the empathy. That's a powerful trait. Compassion brings people together. It fixes problems. It's the source of good leadership. It's how you rally people and inspire them. It's how you create social change. That's compassion and empathy. And then you have this powerful capacity to go deep on things. So in studies, sensitive people and sensitive monkeys have an edge at a lot of cognitive tasks because of their sensitivity. So there's one wonderful study where they actually used little fruit reward. They used pieces of fruit as snacks to reward the monkeys, and they gave them a bunch of tasks to do that were all kind of cognitive tasks. So things like, there's a pattern, and every time you figure out the pattern and hit the button or whatever, you'll get a treat. If you get it wrong, you won't. But the pattern changes after a while. So how long does it take you to switch from doing the old pattern that got you fruit that's no longer working to getting the new pattern and figuring out, oh, this is how it works now? They also did predictive tasks, like they would do gambling tasks and see how much fruit the monkeys could win by successfully predicting outcomes on things, and a variety of others. And the monkeys who, based on their genes, are the ones who are most sensitive, consistently racked up more fruit snacks than the other monkeys. They just hoarded this fruit, they didn't hoard it, they're monkeys, they ate it immediately, but they just were racking it up and getting out ahead. And the same thing is true with studies in human beings. And of course, we don't have to rely just on the genes with human beings. We can also give a sensitivity assessment where you answer a large number of questions, and we can tell pretty well how sensitive you are. Sensitive people tend to be better decision makers. Thinking through things pays off. Right. Not always. Sometimes making a quick decision, shooting from the hip, sometimes that pays off, and the sensitive person who's still thinking about it might, miss out on something. But by and large, on the average, that deep thinking, that extra time you put into it, it actually comes out ahead over the people who shoot from the hip, over the quick decision makers, over the decisive people. And even in a wonderful computer simulation that was done of natural selection, they basically programmed all these little, I guess called creatures, these little units in this simulation, to respond to their environment in different ways. Some would behave more like sensitive people or sensitive creatures. So they would spend more of their energy, more of their resources, retaining information about things they figured out before, and how to get certain resources in the environment or where things were located or things like that. And others were a little more conservative. They're like, I'm going to remember some important information, but I'm not going to sit here kind of, overstimulating myself, using up all my energy on every little detail. And over generation after generation, the sensitive creatures came out ahead. They actually won natural selection and just racked up more resources than the competitors. So there's a reason why highly sensitive people are not 1% of the population or 2% of the population. They're 30%. It's because it's a very adaptive trait. It's something that keeps individuals alive, and it keeps our families or our groups alive as well. It keeps our species alive because you're not just making those good decisions for yourself. As a sensitive person, you do score higher than average on empathy. You have a strong sense of caring about other people's needs. So the same person who's figuring out, oh, here's how we can get more resources, is also, if you're a sensitive person, likely thinking, oh, here's how I could use that to help other people too. It gets you ahead, right? Gets everybody ahead. So it's a really valuable trait. You should never undervalue your sensitivity. If you are a sensitive person, it is one of the greatest things about you. And rather than shame, you should feel a sense of pride. The only worry you should have about being sensitive is, oh, I better make sure I appear humble about it because I don't want to look like I'm showing off by being so more sensitive than everyone else.
That is definitely taking ownership, right?
Yeah.
It is. That reminds me, I do have a line here about leadership, and you touched on that a little earlier while you were talking, that people who are sensitive are quickly and deeply affected by their environment, and it is the very thing that makes sensitive people good leaders. And that is the, quote, ability to step into other people's experiences. And there was another line about using the analogy of being plugged in. And I felt that resonated so much with me, because being plugged in sometimes means that you're overstimulated and feeling overly responsible for all the people that you are sensitive to. But at the same time, it is the thing that allows you to be multifaceted in your thinking, or to be thinking outside of yourself. And so I've carried that sort of, like in some ways, like plugged into the matrix, I suppose, in some ways, but
right. Yeah.
But I think that is a really good way of explaining why that deep thinking is so, it's not insular. It actually is very expansive in many ways. So I have more and more, but we're going to jump over to some questions just to engage all our folks who are visiting and have all these great questions. I'm going to leave this answer to you. Curious if the author's criteria for highly sensitive person varies from that of the researcher and author Elaine Aron, and if your book references her work.
It's a great question. Yeah. So for those who don't know, so Elaine Aron I would call her the godmother of sensitivity research. She is not the first person who studied high sensitivity, but she is the first person who gave it that name. And she's one of the first researchers who studied it. And she's a prolific researcher who still publishes to this day. She also published a book that's aimed more at general audiences in, I want to say, 1996, called The Highly Sensitive Person. It's a wonderful book. Elaine Aron is an inspiration. She's a legend. So yeah, we absolutely do reference her in the book. We reference her work. And Jen and I have had the privilege to be able to interview her and kind of correspond with her a little bit. She's been very helpful. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's anything in the book that would contradict what Elaine Aron says. I think her work is foundational. It's been revised and kind of, fine-tuned in some ways over the years by other researchers. And, thankfully now sensitivity research is a huge field. I mean, there's hundreds of researchers around the globe in neurology, child development, just general psychology, genetics, et cetera, who are studying high sensitivity. So no, I think we very much stay true to her foundation. I also think there's been a lot of really significant developments in how researchers view sensitivity over the past 30 years. And it's a lot of fascinating new work going on, I guess I would say. For one thing, I mean, we now know that the number of highly sensitive people are a little bit more than what Elaine Aron originally thought. It's not 15% or 20%. It's generally around 30%. We also kind of see sensitivity itself in this kind of I mean, we have sort of a bigger picture of it now, not just Jen, my co-author, and myself, but the entire sensitivity research community, including Elaine Aron, have kind of a bigger view now of just the many ways in which it affects in which it kind of reaches its hands into child development and psychology and your success in your career and all kinds of other things. So I believe that we go far beyond what Elaine Aron has in her book, but I don't think we contradict her in any significant way. I know Elaine Aron would still disagree a little bit about the 30% number. I think there's different ways you can do some of the statistic regression on these numbers, and she feels strongly it should be slightly lower. But the consensus from most sensitivity researchers, including a number of her co-authors, is it's probably around 30%.
So we have a question here from Marjorie about relationships. And I too have a number of notes about relationships too, and that being a sensitive person in relationships can be really challenging. And I was floored by, and I think Marjorie would enjoy and relate to, the chapter on full-hearted love. And it was, I think there's one of the case studies or stories that you tell is about a marriage that's on the brink of dissolution because of one person's sensitivity, and how they, while that sensitivity might have drawn the two together, it also pushed them apart, and then how they came back together when they understood how the one person's sensitive traits had sort of affected the relationship and created distance. And Marjorie says that she is a highly sensitive person tending to be introverted, but very much likes people. And so friendships are hard to find, and maybe that she even feels like she's trying too hard. And I think that there are some strategies in the book about building relationships, both protecting yourself, but not pushing people away. Where do you go with that, that question about relationships and how hard they are?
Yeah, I love that it's kind of rooted in friendship too. I think obviously a lot could be said about romantic relationships for sensitive people, but friendship often gets overlooked. And yeah, I mean, I think the thing about having a mind that's wired to go deep is you crave depth in everything you do. You want deepness in your life. If at work, you want a sense of meaning in the job you do, right? And in your relationships, you want a deeper connection. There's nothing wrong with having kind of more casual friendships, but it's not that satisfying to a highly sensitive person. I think part of what I hear in Marjorie's question is that you're introverted as well. And I think there's this really interesting overlap between sensitivity and introversion. Not all sensitive people are introverts. You can be an introvert or an extrovert, but introversion and sensitivity often get kind of mixed up a little bit. But I think even extroverted sensitive people do their social time differently than other extroverts do. If you're a sensitive person, doesn't matter how extroverted you are, you're probably not going to really enjoy a huge networking event with 200 people in a conference space. You're not going to like that. You're going to get overstimulated. Instead, sensitive extroverts get their people time by meeting a few friends, one-on-one, or just a group of 2 or 3 or 4 to have dinner or have a drink, and they'll try to choose places that are quieter venues. Like, you don't want to go to the really loud bar. You might want to go to a quieter restaurant, or you might choose a time of day when it's not at its peak dinner rush. And I think that advice is really useful for sensitive introverts as well. You might not want to go out as often as a sensitive extrovert. And I'm saying this as an introvert myself, although a fairly social introvert, I might be closer to the middle of that, continuum. I don't want to go out as often as an extrovert would, but even when I do, when I'm fired up to go see people and meet people, it's got to be somewhere that's a little less stimulating, and I prefer a smaller group. So if you're looking to either make more friends or to deepen and keep fostering the friendships that you already have that you really value, I think you should start thinking about what kinds of small, intimate events you can plan. One of my favorite things that I used to do is I had a happy hour I would do once a month where and it was on a quieter night. It's not when everything's really packed and busy. And I'd invite my various creative and interesting friends, even if I didn't know them that well, acquaintances even, and say, come on by if you can. And that way you're getting all the most kind of interesting and creative people in one space. And it's not just about me connecting with each one of them. I would actually hang back a lot. It would be more about, well, you have all these interesting people who don't know each other that well yet. And then when they start talking, they have like idea babies, right? Like things get more interesting. Interestingness compounds.
Yeah.
As you start to get closer with people who are in, and you start to foster the relationship, you kind of get to be at the middle of things without having to be constantly going out and socializing and doing a whole bunch of stuff. Eventually that event actually grew too big, so I stopped doing it. So you might have that problem.
Too much. Yeah.
But plan a small dinner party once a month
Yeah.
where you invite, like, 3 friends or 4 friends you know really well, and like 2 people you don't know that well yet, a coworker or that person that you thought was interesting that you talked to briefly at that networking event or whatever, and be really upfront with people. Like, hey, I'm getting people together that I think are interesting and creative, and we're going to get to know each other better. So it's not that awkward vibe of like, well, everyone knows each other except me. I think that's a fun way to do it.
That's great advice. And I think it highlights one of the takeaways that I have from the book. And that is, like, once we become aware of where we are as sensitive people, it's really about making choices, making deliberate choices, whether it's about our time or about where we spend it or how we create opportunities for making friends, or, there's we control our environment. We are the only ones who can. And it doesn't necessarily mean saying no to events. It means maybe taking the responsibility to create one that you can flourish in. And I think that that's an important takeaway from the book, is that a lot of this has to do with, once you get comfortable with the fact that this is what is how you're processing the world, that you are taking steps in order to create an environment that works better for you. And so I want to touch on a question that Ashley has asked here. I'm hoping to get to at least one more topic after this one, but this one's probably pretty big. But I have notes on this as well. And I think there are probably a lot of people on this call who have children. And I think Ashley, it sounds here like, might be a teacher and or is responsible for creating an environment for children. But we also have parents, I'm sure, on here. So Ashley asks, wondering if the book includes anything on the way of our school structure creates issues for highly sensitive children. But I think you might also talk about how families can adapt their environment to raise highly sensitive children in a way that really helps them flourish, as opposed to creates sensitivity deniers.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I love this question. So for us about schools, so yeah, we have an entire chapter about raising a sensitive generation. A lot of it is aimed at parents. There is stuff in there about schools. I will just say, for starters, that actually the thing that made me finally decide, oh, I'm definitely a sensitive person. Because I didn't know that growing up about myself. I denied it for a long time. And it wasn't until I started getting into the research about high sensitivity that I realized, oh, wait, this is me. And it was a specific paper. The author is a research paper, but the author used her own son, whose name is Owen, as a case study. And she talks about how he started first grade and he hated it. He hated it. And it was breaking her heart because, I mean, any given kid might not be the biggest fan of school, that's fair, but he was miserable. He would come home every day and she'd ask how his day was. He would say he hated it. He had problems with he wasn't doing as well academically as she thought he could. He didn't want to go to school. He started to have all kinds of issues. And it was partly because that specific teacher that he had, who might have been a great teacher for other kids, she was pretty stern. But it was also partly just the overstimulating environment of his first grade classroom, which I can definitely relate to. This is the hardest part of school when I started school as a kid for me. And it was not until she actually switched where he went to school that he had a different kind of environment. It was a school that was, I'm guessing, some kind of alternative school or charter school, but they actually played soft classical music in the hallways between classes. So it kind of subtly discouraged things getting too loud. They did a variety of things different in the classroom to make the classroom just like visually, artistically more pleasant place to be. Sensitive people are often aesthetically sensitive too. And the teacher this is the reason she actually switched, was somebody who was much more about, getting to know each kid, giving them personal, I mean, you only have so much time to give personal attention to individual children, but getting to know them and sort of just treating them more as like little people and not like, something to be kind of bossed around. And just that change in approach, which I think would benefit many kids, like most kids would be better with this second approach. But it was a night and day difference for him. So teachers have a huge power to affect how sensitive people, of course, and all kids do in school, and what kind of, not just how they do in class, like not just how their grades are, but kind of how happy they are as human beings and how they learn to flourish and thrive. But as parents, we have the power to do that too. I have a 2-year-old son. I will not say whether he's a highly sensitive person for sure. He will unfold however he unfolds, and it's fine with me either way. He shows some signs that he might be, right? And parenting a sensitive child is different. I think it can be frustrating for a lot of parents. An adult sensitive person might have figured out a lot of things about their sensitivity. They can kind of tell when they're getting overstimulated, or they might have an idea of what to do if that's the case. A sensitive child has no idea. They don't have the words for the emotions yet. They don't know why they're getting cranky and tired and having a meltdown. They'll just get more and more overstimulated without showing it until it's meltdown time. And it just have these weird things coming out of nowhere. And they also can, one of the great things about sensitive children is all sensitive people tend to have higher level of conscientiousness. You just see that over and over when you give a personality test. This is true for sensitive kids too. They tend to be the kids who sincerely want to make the teacher happy, make their parents happy, do the right thing. Of course, every kid will be mischievous sometimes. My son certainly is, but they generally just want to be good. And when they can see that they've done something that's maybe not perceived as good, it breaks their little heart in this really rough way. And the same kind of discipline that might seem very normal and a different kid might need in order to get the message through to them that that was not okay and you can't do that. That's way too much for a sensitive kid a lot of the time. It's really heartbreaking for them. So gentle parenting is important. And all in all, for parents, the words I tell you to memorize are, so-and-so, my son, is very sensitive. And that's something we're trying to encourage. Say that to a teacher, say that to another parent. That is a conversation changer. Right. And as a teacher, you can take that same mindset and okay, I'm identifying the sensitive kids in my class. I know this trait is tied to deep thinking. I know it's tied to creativity. I know that if it's nourished, it can take them really big places. So how do I encourage it? How do I help give them the environment they need? Part of that might be talking to the parents. So yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. Are there more resources or more conversation about this at highlysensitiverefuge.com?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a lot of resources on the site. There's an entire parenting section about sensitive kids, sensitive teens. There's things about being a highly sensitive person who is a parent, right? Because parenting is stressful for anyone. What if you're sensitive? Little kids, older kids, everything. Yeah.
That's great. We, of course, so quickly, these hours go by so quickly. We have about 5 minutes left. And I do want to touch on something that I think it will resonate with most people who identify as being sensitive, and that is the pain of empathy. And I think I'm going to say generally, people who are very sensitive have a tendency to be, as we've talked about, plugged into the greater network of people, and they have a greater sense, as you just mentioned, of wanting to do well and wanting to do the right thing for people. And they tend to go into service or some kind of helping field where they're caregivers, or they generally, I'm sure a lot of the teachers that we are just talking about have those may be sensitive in that way. And that can cause a lot of burnout, a quick road to burnout. And you talk a lot about that in your book. And I think that in terms of those people who go into helping professions, who are the angels in the world, but who are also burning out. You talk, as you already mentioned once, but let's delve into it a little bit, the difference between empathy and compassion, and how you don't have to trade your empathy. You don't have to become a hard person in order to do some of this work. You don't have to distance yourself to the point where you no longer feel, but you can use compassion to do that same good work without losing yourself. If I'm representing that correctly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah. So I'll start by saying this. I always thought that empathy and compassion were just like two different words for essentially the same thing. That is not really how researchers use them. So empathy is when we use that word, we really mean you see someone feeling a certain way and you start to feel that way too. You feel the same way with them. So they're crying and you start to feel sad, or they're happy. Empathy can be a really powerful, good thing too. It's not always painful. It's part of why parties are so much fun. You see a bunch of people joking and laughing. You want to start joking and laughing. You feel good too. So it's this kind of ability for us to become infected by emotions from other people around us. And it happens through social cues and emotional cues and tiny, micro expressions and body language things and the words we use and everything else. But emotions are contagious. And empathy is something that highly sensitive people score very highly for. In brain studies, we see that highly sensitive people show more activation in their mirror neuron networks and parts of the brain associated with empathy, both for positive and negative things, not only from people they know or care about, but also from complete strangers. And that's a key difference from people who are average sensitivity or less, is that, of course, everyone can feel empathy for a stranger, but it's much harder to trigger that sense of empathy for a stranger in most people. It's actually fairly easy in a highly sensitive person. So they really have this sense of caring about people kind of more broadly, which is a cool thing. But that also means that any kind of stress, suffering, anger, resentment, anything else you see around you, even just, the other person sitting on the bus while I'm on my way to work, or that person in the cafe across from me, that can start to really get to you. You start to feel the same thing. And, we often hear the term empath. I think that even Judith Orloff, the author of the kind of leading empath book, has agreed that, she thinks that scientifically speaking, the explanation for empaths is that they're highly sensitive people, right? That's what we mean by that word. So when you think of people who feel the same feelings as other people, they soak them up, that's a highly sensitive person. Not every highly sensitive person has it to that degree, but it's common. That's hard. Who wants to go around soaking up all the misery of humanity? But that's empathy. And compassion is something different. Compassion is when you take the time to understand the perspective of the person that's feeling this thing. You can feel empathy instantly. You see somebody angry, you start to get nervous and maybe a little angry too. But you don't know their story. You don't know what's upset them or anything else about them. Compassion takes time, for one thing. It takes asking questions. Empathy is about me. Now I feel sad. Compassion is about what made you feel sad. And it's this subtle shift, but that little tiny subtle shift has a big difference in how we feel. So we think of empathy as a good thing. It is. It holds people together, but it is a double-edged sword. When you feel empathy for someone else who's going through something difficult, we know that your heart rate starts to go up. Your breathing becomes faster. You release cortisol, the stress hormone in your body. You become tense. And there's a desire in many cases to want to get out of there, right? Empathy can actually move people farther apart because, unless you're my very close friend and I'm really going to give you the benefit of the doubt and sit here and talk you through something, a lot of times you're just like, I don't have the bandwidth for this. Like, I'm sorry you feel that way, but gotta go. That's the downside of empathy. But compassion brings us closer. When people start to practice compassion, their heart rate slows, they become calmer, their brain activity becomes calmer, and their breathing becomes slower and deeper. And the focus is not on themselves and how they feel, the focus is on the other person. And the two people start to become closer. They start to kind of lean in toward each other. And it's really just that subtle shift of starting to think about what's their perspective, what do they need, how did they get here? And you do that, if possible, by asking them questions and talking about it and really listening more than anything. And that's how you escape all kinds of things that people use to get rid of the discomfort of empathy. Toxic positivity comes when you don't want to listen to the person's story. You want to just say something that feels better and get out of there, right? So you can get past that. You can get past that sort of difficulty of absorbing emotions. When people practice compassion, empathy isn't so hard anymore. Suddenly you don't feel that burned out or overwhelmed by somebody else's negativity. You're starting to understand it and you're starting to help them with it. That's a powerful shift.
That's incredible. And I think that, I think my heart rate just lowered even having you talk about it. Like just knowing that there's a different there's a way to frame doing good in the world where you don't feel like you're going to be drained by it, but instead we can really ask what the other person needs or ask what they really are feeling, and not try to intuit it ourselves, because we have a tendency to do that because we're sensitive people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
empathy, I
that's
think-
great.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Compassion comes with an ability to set boundaries too.
Right.
And I think that's harder with empathy. With empathy, you just start feeling this thing. And I think something we hear from a lot of highly sensitive people is that they feel like they can't turn it off.
Mhm.
Sometimes you want to turn it off. But compassion implies an ability to set boundaries as well. Like you can't, like part of compassion is the ability to say, you know, I can't do that thing you're asking me for, but here's what I can do.
Mhm.
That's different than just feeling whatever the other person's feeling. That's sitting down and thinking about, you know, I actually, you know, I have to work early tomorrow. I can't come over right now and help you talk through all this late at night. What I can do is, you know, why don't we meet for coffee tomorrow? Or why don't we, or do you have someone else you can call? Or, you know, can I, whatever it is you can offer the person. And you can be very honest about your limits and your own needs as a compassionate person without losing the compassion. And that's a powerful thing too, because you can't just give and give and give, whether it's compassion or empathy, forever. You'll have a limit, and you can't burn yourself out helping other people. You'll actually do more good for others if you have compassion for yourself as well. So self-compassion is part of compassion.
I can't think of a better line to end this conversation with, which I don't really want to do, but we must. Because we all have boundaries. And of course, if you want to learn more about boundary setting, you should go to the link that Daniel posted in the chat. You should also visit the site, Highly Sensitive Refuge. And it's a wonderful book that I think is really going to resonate with so many people, and give them strategies for addressing some of the things that can really prevent them from living in the world as fully as they possibly can. So thank you very much, Andre.
Thank you very much for having me. This has been great.
Thanks everybody for
Thank
coming.
you.
The event's recorded. We'll be sending out, believe Porchlight will be sending out the recording in a few days, and please share it with others. And there's a link to purchase. You can get it from us or from your favorite independent bookstore, whichever it is. Thank you all.